Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's special coverage. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had palpable ripple effects. Around the world, it has contributed to rising prices of energy, food, and other goods, which has in turn spurred central banks to aggressively increase interest rates this year. In turn, the global economy is slowing, recession seems increasingly likely, and equity markets have been decimated. This is All 24 News special coverage, a jingle, and we come back. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm your host, Karim Fazakari. Before we delve into any discussion, here's the latest. Moscow says parts of its vital road and rail bridge linking Russia to Crimea have been partially destroyed in a truck explosion in a blow to the Kremlin's war efforts in Ukraine. The Kerch Bridge is a key supply line for Russian troops fighting in eastern Ukraine. The incident is an incredibly important setback, both from a logistic point of view and for prestige. The bridge carried a huge amount of road and railway traffic crucial for Russian army to supply itself in Crimea. The bridge was heavily protected not only by the Russian army and navy, but by President Vladimir Putin's personal presidential guards. It may be just a bit of luck, but it is an incredibly successful strike, assuming it was carried out by Ukrainians, according to analysts.
The main investigation department of the Russian Investigative Committee has opened a criminal case about the incident at the Crimean Bridge. According to the preliminary information, this morning a truck was blown up on the automobile part of the Crimean Bridge from the Taman Peninsula, which led to the ignition of 7 fuel tanks of a train traveling toward the Crimean Peninsula. As a result, 2 car roads of the bridge partially collapsed.
All right, let's bring in our guest. Joining me live from USA via Skype is Professor Hamoud Salhi, an Associate Dean of International Educator at California University, along with Mr. Mark Lowe, an expert on international relations from Italy. Gentlemen, thank you indeed for agreeing to be with us. And let's kick off the discussion with you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. What seems to be perhaps a naive question, but who is winning the war in Ukraine, according to you? If Russia loses the war, Russia is going to be different. But if Russia wins, Europe is going to be different. How do you read it yourself, Dr. Hamoud Salhi?
I think the bottom line, and thank you for the invitation, Karim, and honored to be with your guest as well. It's a tough question. I think the easiest answer and way out of it is that there is no winner at this point. There are huge implication on the global scene that have affected the global economy on all levels. We're talking about we were just about recovering from the pandemic. And now we have been hit by this crisis, the war in Ukraine. The second thing is that it depends who you're talking to. There is a huge propaganda war between the two parties. Each one try to maximize on the benefits of public relations. So if you hear in the Europeans, the American media, the Russians are collapsing. If you hear in the Russians, they are winning the war, or they went in the special operations, they would say. The bottom line, as you presented in the clip, there is a shift in this war, namely that the Ukrainians are getting more help, that now there is a focus on strategic infrastructure, like the bridge that was destroyed, and things like that. Those have a huge impact on Russia. In addition to what we're reading, the failure of mobilizing the 300,000 recruits or soldiers, those seems to point that the Russians are having serious problems on this front, and it's as expected. At the same time, the Ukrainian also, there is so much hype on it. It is clear that this is a resistance movement from their perspective, but they also have felt on many other levels, and the challenge for the Europeans, for the American, can they sustain it? So Karim, to go around your answer, there is no winner. Both parties are losing, and the worst thing is that the world is losing. And this is why it's very, very important to reach a solution to this conflict.
Very nice indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. And let me address this question to you, Mr. Mark Lowe. It seems as though the military momentum is on the Ukrainian side, just like Professor Hamoud Salhi was just explaining to us. Here, what's the potential use of technical nuclear weapons to guarantee the win for Russia? And do you think that the consequences of resorting to such solution are understood in Russia?
That's a very, very good question. So let's go in order. First and foremost, thoroughly agree with the professor that there are no winners. There can not be any winners. And unfortunately, we also have to enlarge the scenario and talk in terms of stakeholders that go out with those of the Ukrainian and the Russian stakeholders. This is a conflict that is involving everybody. It has global implications. Close parenthesis on that. The use of a tactical nuclear weapon. Well, I think that unfortunately we have to say that one, through conventional military means, Russia is not making any progress. Quite the opposite. Russia has demonstrated that in terms of military power, it is anything but a superpower. Now, we have a situation where we have to look at this from an alternative point of view, from a number of alternative points of view. And unfortunately, one convincing scenario, if you like, is yes, the use of a tactical weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon, could actually be a means for resolving this concept. Now, this might sound quite ridiculous, but in a scenario whereby we have to expect absolutely everything, in a scenario where the Russian leader is losing credibility, in a scenario where Putin has to absolutely protect his position of power within the Kremlin, within Russia, where we have a Russian public that is not particularly well informed. We all know perfectly well that Russian media is enormously censored. We also know perfectly well that the centers of intellectual presence, intellectual thought are probably confined to Moscow and St. Petersburg. The rest of the country is anything but a hotbed of intellectual thought. So let me get to the point. The point is the following. Putin can consider the West as fighting a proxy war, using the Ukraine to fight a proxy war against Russia. And this is a message that the Russian population will understand. However, if we take that up, if we scale that up, if we take that to another level where it's no longer a proxy war, but an all-out conflict between the West, between NATO members specifically, and Russia, then we have a very different scenario. We have a scenario where Russia as a nation is at danger, and therefore, according to Russian military doctrine, the use of a tactical nuclear device would actually be permissible. Now, obviously, we all cross our fingers, we all touch wood, we all make whatever gesture is required to protect ourselves in some superstitious manner, but quite logically, I do not for a moment imagine a scenario, I don't think that anybody for a moment imagines a scenario where we see the United States of America, NATO, all of Europe drawn into any form of particularly violent nuclear conflict. Definitely not, and quite thankfully, because we've never had experience of this, thankfully. However, the use of a small tactical device would bring about a sharp reaction from the United States of America, first and foremost. If consensus is reached very quickly within NATO, also a very swift reaction from NATO. Said reaction would certainly not be tit-for-tat use of nuclear weapons. Absolutely not. But it would up the ante, it would bring about a considerable increase in the use of a number of deterrents and a number of reactions aimed towards destroying Russian military capability. At that point, Mr. Putin can actually lose a battle. It's perfectly acceptable to lose a fight against the West. It is certainly not acceptable under any circumstances whatsoever to lose a fight against Ukraine. So it's a bizarre logic, but it is in any case one form of logic that cannot be ignored. If I escalate in a very radical fashion, I'm creating the conditions whereby said escalation will create the conditions whereby I can negotiate an end to hostilities without losing face.
Very nice indeed. And Dr. Hamoud Salhi, these scenarios are multiple and the situation is indeed complicated. But why did we have to get here in the first place? How is the perception that flirting with Ukraine with regards to NATO helped to draw Russia into its next Vietnam?
Yeah, you're right. It is a complicated situation. There are two sides to this story. The first one is that there are the root causes of this war, and especially the expansion of NATO, the strategic interest of the United States, the guarantees that the Russians want to have in terms of their security. These are serious issues, and to get here is a reflection, or is a result of the failure of the two major countries who are one directly involved, the other one indirectly or directly involved. Specifically, the two important players in this case, the United States and the Russians. It seems that the war is happening on the Ukrainian side, but the solution, and this is a reality, the solution is in the hands of the United States and Russia. Our failure, or the failure of these two parties to reach a consensus or an agreement specifically to make the Russians feel that their borders are secure, and at the same time, the Europeans and the American feeling that Russia is not a threat, is a reason for it. But behind this is also the strategic interest of the United States. As we have seen in the last perhaps decade or so, the United States has been very clear about in its national strategy that the challenges to their superpowers or hegemony in the globe are the Chinese and the Russians, and that's sort of something seriously to consider in place in the strategic goals that are sort of manifested in this conflict. Connected to that, so in a sense, you have to resolve that consensus. You have to reach a point that the United States and Russia can coexist. Connected to that is the whole idea of the perception of security that the Europeans have had for decades. Namely,
but Dr. Hamoud Salhi, sorry to cut your train of thought, but I wanted to say, why do we have this narrative as though the West have a problem with Putin as a person, but not with Russia as a country? Because we're all the time, listening to this, news and media saying that it's Putin's war, as though the problem of Russia as a country are restricted only to Putin.
And that is a reflection of who controls the media, who sets the narrative, who sets a dialogue, who sets the agenda, I should say, of the media. It is clearly that personalizing the war, in this case, personalizing the European so-called enemy, and making this is a Putin war, makes it easier to argue against and make it easier to project the idea. That is the whole framing of this war. That is, as you said it correctly, Karim, it's a war between a bad guy, someone who has all these characteristics and personal trait ready to destroy the world at all extremes. And then on the other hand, we are the good guys. And that's a false narrative because we need to go beyond the personal. We need to look at it from the real causes. And I think at the root of this is where does Europe fit in this whole structure? Europe learned a lesson, or seemed to have learned a lesson from the Trump era, that it needs to find its own security approach. It also, at the time, I'm sorry I lost the light here.
It's okay.
Maybe the talk about this got nervous, the people on the energy. But the point to this is that this whole idea of European designing its own security system has to be put in place. It is clear from the Trump era that the Americans have a different vision. And here we had Joe Biden who comes in and want to give NATO life.
Very interesting point. Very interesting point. I would like to have Mr. Maklouf comment on that particular point. Mr. Maklouf, how do you read American influence amidst all this? Just like Hamoud Salhi was saying, are we witnessing a crumbling or ascending influence of the US? And why didn't we see this happening in Trump's administration? Do you think that the West now views the US as no longer a reliable partner and they have to build their own security here?
Okay, again, let's go by order. But before doing so, can I just please take a moment to comment on some of the observations made by the professor? Absolutely agree. And one of the most important observations that the professor made was this packaging of the conflict, where we have the bogeyman, the bad man, the big bad wolf. So we're not in any form of conflict against Russia or the Russian people. We all have Russian friends. We all have Russian communities. We all get on very, very well with our Russian friends and communities. So we have to build this narrative, as the professor pointed out, whereby it's the West, the good boys, the cavalry, who are up against the big bad wolf. Close parenthesis on that front. Go back to your questions. Now, what did Europe learn from the Trump years? Obviously, very, very little indeed. There is a perception that the United States of America's interests are not Eurocentric at all. They are not focused on the welfare and the development of Europe, and this is perfectly understandable for a number of reasons. For example, we see a gradual American disengagement from the Middle East, and we see a far greater engagement in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. Now, it is absolutely factual, and it's there to be seen. Europe, in theory, is no longer a child. Europe, in theory, is an adult, is grown up. It will always be very, very close to the United States of America. It's out of the question to reason in terms of considering the United States of America as anything other than a principal ally. So we can put that one to bed. As regards European security, again, we haven't really learned any lessons at all. However, here I would make a distinction between security in terms of the security of the continent's economic development through actions implemented to assure energy security, etc. A distinction between that and another issue that has been raised time and time again over the 227, how many days I'm not absolutely precise on this, but I think we've been in the Ukraine conflict for 227 days now. That said, during that period, there have been a lot of discussions in regards to a European defence force, which personally I find a little bit ridiculous because you must assume that a defence force is there to implement a foreign policy. So first you need a foreign policy and then you need your defense force. Europe does not have any form of common, form of common foreign policy at all.
Understood.
We are the majority of European nations members of NATO. Do we need to replicate? Probably not. Would it be good for the defense industries in the separate European countries? Most certainly it would be very, very good for the shareholders, but very pragmatic one very pragmatic consideration is without foreign policy, you have no requirement whatsoever for a European defence force.
Very nice indeed. And speaking about Europe, following the European political meeting, EU leaders met in Prague for an international gathering where the current energy crisis in Europe is being dominated in the talks. Let's follow the report and we get back to discussion.
While no decisions were expected, there were hopes that the informal discussions between EU leaders in Prague might lead to progress on the energy crisis. But as winter approaches, the pressure mounts, and European leaders still struggle to bridge differences over natural gas price cap.
We have to keep our single market together, and we have to avoid fragmentation. I emphasize once again how crucial that is, and this is an opinion that was widely shared.
Some ideas on the table were those such as grouped energy purchases or a cap on gas prices. A full day of talks in Prague's ornate royal castle seemed to bring EU leaders no closer to deciding on whether or how to cap gas prices.
We are discussing the gas price cap on the forum of the European Council, including, of course, Chancellor Scholz, and there are more and more voices around the table in favor of imposing a gas price cap as quickly as possible.
The general agreement in the meeting is that if it works, it works. We should not work with ideological positions. But we have to prevent measures which will increase the gas price.
Energy experts warn that any sort of price cap would put an end to the price signals that govern the free market and force governments to negotiate over the allocation of supplies, possibly through rationing plans. In addition to tackling the energy crisis, European leaders also pledged on Friday to protect the critical infrastructure following gas leaks from Nord Stream pipelines.
And now we are joined live from Singapore by Mr. James Dorsey, a geopolitical analyst and senior fellow at Middle East Institute, NUS. Mr. James Dorsey, welcome amongst us. How can we, or how can you actually explain the process or the strategy that Europe might actually take in order to step up its energy security and amid all this sabotage in the pipelines that we have witnessed recently? And also a key question is what today's energy crisis means for fossil fuel investment if we are still to achieve, let's say, a collective climate goal.
Well, I think two things. First of all, we've got to distinguish between what are short and middle term problems and what are long term problems. Mm-hmm. So the real issue is at this point the short and middle term. With other words, rising energy prices, and the attempt by Europe to totally become independent of Russian energy. Mm-hmm. And that's going to require measures that, so with other words, if you're going to do the transition to clean energy or a transition away from Russian gas, that is mm-hmm. going to take a period of time, and mm-hmm. somehow you need to bridge it in the meantime. And there are obviously all the domestic political factors arising from rising inflation and rising energy prices. In the longer term, and I think that is also one reason why you saw the OPEC Plus decision as it was taken this week, mm-hmm. Is the issue that, of course, for the in terms of fossil fuels, mm-hmm. if indeed the transition towards cleaner energy succeeds, mm-hmm. there's going to be less demand. Mm-hmm. So you're getting, whichever way you go, you're going to get a restructuring of the energy market.
Mm-hmm. Very nice indeed. Dr. Hamoud Salhi, your response. And in comparison, we can also say that experts are saying that we must not lose sight of the fact that lasting solutions to today's crisis lie indeed in reducing demand via the rapid deployment of renewables, energy efficiency, and other low-emission technologies. How close are we to achieving that?
we are on many levels have made, I should say, a progress toward in that area, and efforts in clean energy and other areas are sort of making a lot of progress in that area as well. I think the one factor that we always come back to is that when you look at the decision, be it on clean air, energy, and all this worldwide institution, it has been left to the states to make the decision to implement what the international institutions have sort of reached. So all agreements are left to the sovereign state. And that's where it gets a little bit complicated. There is a huge gap between the North and the South. There is a lack of responsibility, for example, on corporations or countries that pollute the world. And then there is a lack of revenues for the South, the countries in the South, and the failure of the Northern countries to come through with their pledges. In addition to this, the oil crisis or the gas crisis now is more political than market demand. In other words, there are variables. There are countries that see this as an opportunity to increase their revenues. And then there are the other side who sees this as a way to undermine those revenues. The political goals seems to drive this latest crisis more than a policy to reach some kind of a clean energy or a safer environmental environment. And so we seem to go back to the real concept of states do what protect their interests best.
Absolutely.
And in this case, the big nations, the strategic interest of the United States, Europeans, and the Russians seems to be in the middle of all of this.
Very nice indeed. And speaking of the interest here, perhaps Mr. Mark Lowe can answer this. Making the most of nuclear power in countries around the world is a must to get out of the energy crisis. But don't you think that a reasonable doubt that more countries would use it for non-peaceful purposes? I mean, the doubt absolutely would grow among the West. And what other options in that case do we have?
Well, nuclear power has obviously returned to the forefront in terms of being part of a packet of alternative energy sources. Now, it's quite obvious that nuclear power is not a quick fix. Even if a country was to decide to build nuclear infrastructure tomorrow morning, it would still take a very, very long time before said infrastructure was built and became functional. So it's no quick fix at all. But in terms of addressing future energy concerns and specifically our ever greater requirement for energy, then a lot of countries, certainly here in Europe, are going to be discussing this in the near future and are going to be observing how things develop in Italy as regards nuclear power. Countries throughout the world using nuclear power for alternative reasons, basically using a nuclear capability to build and to use weapons of mass destruction. Well, you know, I don't see Portugal as being any great risk. I don't see a number of other countries that would benefit from nuclear power as being a particularly big risk. We have to be very, very logical here and take a very, very close look at countries that actually represent risks to global security. And at the end of the day, there are not terribly many. There are a great many countries that represent a risk to local or to regional stability, but the vast majority of these countries are not in a position to launch a nuclear program, a civilian program that would then allow them to work towards any eventual nuclear ambitions at all. So I personally am not terribly concerned about that. What I'm far more concerned about is the fact that certainly in Europe, there is still enormous resistance to the concept of nuclear power.
Let me give the final question to Mr. James Dorsey as we have drew to the end of the special coverage. Mr. James Dorsey, as you have pointed out to the, let's say, production cut of the OPEC Plus during that meeting, could we say that the market remains volatile despite the, let's say, positive reassurances that we got from the, this outcome, or let's say this decision? And what do unstable prices mean for production countries? Do they have another option other than cutting the production? I mean, something that wouldn't upset the US?
Well, I think, first of all, the issue is that we're going to see market volatility for some time to come. That is inevitable. In terms of, I don't know that the OPEC Plus decision was primarily an economic decision, even if the Saudis have wanted to present it that way. I think there is a Saudi concern on pricing in the sense that they need to have at least $79, $80 a barrel price in order to be able to balance their budget. And they saw a significant drop in very recently in terms of oil prices, down to about $85. What we're much more saying is, as one of your other speakers also suggested, is that this is as much a political as it is an economic issue. And I don't think that, despite all the reporting that we've seen on the OPEC Plus meeting, that this was simply Saudi Arabia siding with Russia. I think what it was much more trying to put the squeeze on the United States, because the Saudis really want a much more formal, and in that sense, much more security of arrangement with the United States, which they have been asking for some time, and the United States has not been responding to. So I think that as a result, in answer to your question, of both economic and political factors, we're in for a period of market volatility.
Thank you so much, Mr. James Dorsey. Mr. Mark Lowe, thank you as well for your thorough analysis, and the same goes for you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. With this, our special coverage comes to an end. And for more stories, you can visit our social media platforms. Bye for now.